Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, June 23rd. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, scientific breakthroughs don't run on short timelines, but federal funding is starting to. Plus, a lot of science policy doesn't fail, it just never makes it through the system. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. Every year, agencies award billions of dollars in grants and other federal funding to finance infrastructure projects across the country. But few of those dollars come attached with cyber requirements, despite repeated warnings that foreign hackers are targeting power utilities and other critical infrastructure. A new report from the Institute for Security and Technology is now offering Congress and the Trump administration several options for factoring cybersecurity into federal funding. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday spoke with IST's Senior Vice President for Policy, Nicholas Leiserson.
One of the challenges that I think we've seen is there's increasingly, unsurprisingly, right, when the federal government makes investments of any sort in infrastructure, in program services, whatever it may be, when they buy things directly or on behalf of folks, right, on behalf of states, local governments, things like that, increasingly they're buying information communications technologies and services, whether it's directly or it's operational technology. And there's a broad consensus that probably it makes sense that those things should be secure, that you want to buy things that are secure by design, that you want to have intentionality about what you're investing in so that it will be cyber secure, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure. However, what we don't see is consistent application of cybersecurity requirements associated with these programs. And in fact, if you look at the major spending bills Congress has passed the last couple of years, 5-ish years, only one of them, the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021, has real cybersecurity requirements that are tied to the grant program. And that's for one agency, the Department of Energy. So only a fraction of the total dollars and the total number of programs that are in that law.
Yeah, let's talk about that specific example, the Department of Energy and what they do through Caesar's oversight, I think. What's working there and what isn't? Because I think the report has some interesting kind of duality, details on the duality of that program.
In the bipartisan infrastructure law, there were a number of new programs at the Department of Energy for a wide range of upgrades to the grid, right? A bit prescient because we're now hearing a lot more about the grid. And foundational to the programs in BIL, there's a section in the law that says any of the investments that are made under this act need to have a cybersecurity plan that is submitted as part of the project proposal that you're getting money for, and that is then reviewed by Caesar. And on the plus side, that's great for a couple of reasons, right? One is this is not a common thing that we see. This is Congress very intentionally saying, we know that there are threats to the electric grid. We know we're making generational investments to improve the performance of the grid. We should make sure that those investments are secure by design. Also, we know that the program offices who are going to do the grant making are not necessarily going to be cybersecurity experts. So we're going to have the Sector Risk Management Agency that we have in the form of Caesar do reviews. However, there are some challenges, right? One is this is sort of, even with this section, it's a may, not a shall. So it's not, thankfully to date, Caesar has kept saying, we're just going to keep doing it, which is great. But in general, I'm not sure that discretion should live with the secretary, as opposed to, if you're going to go to the bother of writing out in statute, you should probably say it's a requirement, not a nice to have, because the concern is competing priorities may show up someday, and this should be table stakes. Having security baked in should be table stakes. It shouldn't be a nice to have, it's a need to have.
Well, what specifically are you looking at as means to get these ideas implemented here in the relative near term?
We have an appendix that's just like this is some drop-in language that you could use, whether it's for the executive branch, the legislative branch, that might help if you wanted to apply ideas like the BIL. This is a way that you could frame it, tweak it a little bit, put it in with a grant program. And there are opportunities that I think we'll see with the surface transportation reauthorization, the highway bill that's coming up soon would be a good example, or the National Defense Authorization Act, where you can plug and play some of the concepts here. The other thing is the uniform guidance from OMB is out for comment right now, right? And like there is a broad way of doing this within the executive branch of just saying OMB already is taking steps to say you need to do more on cybersecurity to protect federal dollars and federal data. And it's not a big step from where I sit to say, and the assets that you're buying with the federal dollars. That's a pretty intuitive step, and you could make a significant difference by updating the uniform guidance to include that just simple concept. But maybe most fundamentally, there is some really good guidance that came out of the Office of the National Cyber Director and CISA in December of 2024 on how grant-making organizations at the federal level, grant recipients, and even pass-through entities like states who might be administering, getting a tranche of money, highway fund money, and then passing it through, re-granting it, or contracting out. There's guidance for all three of those levels on how you can incorporate cybersecurity into project plans. There are project templates, there are terms and conditions, there is language ready to go for notices of funding opportunity. Like, this is a turnkey solution that unfortunately we've not seen a ton of pickup for. And I think that is the most proximate way to just say, the more grant-making organizations can pick up, look at this playbook, say, we tried it, we used the no-fo language, used the terms and conditions, this is what we saw on the other end, here's how to tweak it. It is a well-considered turnkey solution for this kind of problem that just needs, I think, some more oxygen, some more sunlight in terms of awareness raising, and then maybe a little bit of a push from policymakers to say, oh yes, now that we see that this tool does help close that last mile gap, here's how we can incentivize folks to use it.
That's Nicholas Leiserson, Senior Vice President for Policy at the Institute for Security and Technology, speaking with Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. You can find Justin's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, scientific breakthroughs don't run on short timelines, but federal funding is starting to. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal funding and independent universities have long worked together to drive American innovation. But with support becoming less predictable, universities say the strain is showing in both research activity and the talent pipeline. Joining me to explain the impact on future discoveries is the president of MIT, Dr. Sally Kornbluth. Dr. Kornbluth, I know you have a very busy schedule, so thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
You are on a campaign to make the case that the U.S. research system, which is federal funding plus independent universities, is really a national asset. From your perspective there at MIT, what is it about that system that makes it work so well?
Well, research in this country is really done in three places: universities, national labs, and industry. And the reason that the partnership between the federal government and universities has worked so well is that universities tackle problems that take long-term commitment, protected from short-term pressures of politics and profits. And basically, it allows very basic, fundamental, curiosity-driven research to be done in a way that allows us to simply understand how things work. Now, the reason that's important is that the discoveries that lead to improvements in everyday life that we enjoy, whether it be medical treatments or communications networks or new technologies, all of these things began with very basic research in universities with scientists trying to understand the world around them. Now, industry does a lot for this country in terms of, bringing discoveries to market. We partner with industry quite a lot, but they don't have the time or the patience for the long road that it takes to bring things to fruition. And, there are no shareholders that are willing to wait, 30 years for returns on their investment. And so the investment the federal government makes in this sort of research is necessary for the long-term prosperity of the nation.
And where are you seeing the system under most pressure right now?
Well, one of the most worrisome things is that we've seen about a 20% cut in the federal research dollars that we're receiving. And this is true at many, many, many institutions across the country. And so our concern is that this will simply mean, first of all, that we will do less research. And second of all, that we will have fewer graduate students, fewer people who will be the scientific leaders of the future, because the way that graduate education is supported in this country is through federal research dollars that are used to train these individuals to be the kind of researchers that can move the ball down the field in the future.
Are you seeing this kind of pressure across the disciplines, or is it focused in certain areas? I mean, we hear a lot from this administration about their focus on health science, but are you seeing it in computing, agriculture, engineering across the board?
We can't figure out what the pattern is really. Now, obviously, there are areas that we've seen in, places that MIT does not have. Like, for instance, schools of public health are suffering all over the country because of cuts, for instance, to USAID dollars going away. Medical schools are seeing, particular areas of health research that are in danger. But what we're seeing is cuts in all sorts of areas, whether it be chemistry or physics or biology. And, I've met some scientists here at MIT who say in peer review, they've gotten the best scores of their lives. That means when their grants have gone for competitive peer review, they've gotten wonderful scores and they're still not seeing any money. So we can't figure out why those dollars are not flowing.
You mentioned also your concern about the talent pipeline. Talk to me a little bit more about the balance between U.S. students, international students, and what you're seeing on the ground right now.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a decrease in our graduate applications in many arenas, and we're accepting fewer graduate students because of the need to support them on federal grants. But international graduate students are a particular area of concern. So, look, we want to support domestic students, domestic education, but we also want to take the best talent in the world from wherever it comes. And I will say the U.S. has benefited enormously from this. When I look at our international students that come to MIT, the majority of them stay in this country. They build their careers here. They build their lives here. They have contributed enormously to the economic success of this country. And what we're seeing now is students, for instance, from China, they have fantastic opportunities in China now. China is pouring money into research. They are supporting the next generation of scientists. So a student who might otherwise have come to MIT will think, where is my future going to be? The other thing we're concerned about when it comes to international students has to do with visas. So, there's suggestions that visas should be much shorter. And, as I said, curiosity-driven research takes time. And I wouldn't come to the U.S. if I felt that my research might be cut off midstream, either because my visa expires and I have to go back, or because the funding stream has been terminated, which is also being discussed. We talk about termination of research because it doesn't yield anything. Well, you know what? It takes such a long time. You have to be patient.
Dr. Kornbluth, you've also taken a very public position on these issues from the MIT chair. How did you think about that decision for MIT and what implications it might have for the broader university?
It's interesting. MIT, I'd say, more than any place I can think of, has been based primarily on merit. People come from all over the world. The science has been funded based on MIT scientists being competitive and getting awards based on merit. And so to us, that is a bedrock value that we can't compromise. I mean, even if we look in the student realm, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but we give free tuition to any family that earns under $200,000 because we want students to be able to come to MIT regardless of their background, regardless of their means, if they have the talent. And I just felt that MIT is representative of several things in this country. One is opportunity, no matter where you come from. The other is this hands-on ethos where students come here and they learn not just to think about things, they learn to build things, to make things for the future of this country. And so, for me, this is not an emotional issue, it's a factual issue. MIT is incredibly important for this country and for the economy. And so there's never been any question that we have to speak up for these principles.
And I want to come back to the policy influence question. You talked earlier about not being able to spot a pattern in how the administration has tackled these kind of science grants. Are you concerned and are you seeing evidence of policy influence in the direction of scientific research?
We haven't seen that at MIT. Again, we tend to focus so much on hard science. It would be a little difficult to see that here, but it does concern me that there is conversation about having a tier of research above, if you will, merit-based scientific peer review, a tier of judgment as to which funds should be released. And, that's of concern because the system isn't perfect. No system is perfect. But by and large, this country has thrived through peer review based on scientific excellence. And so I'm concerned about, things that would be interposed between that and the conduct of science.
And as you watch this and as you think forward and the political pendulum swings every 2 to 4 years, are there policies or even legislation that you want to advocate for that might help stabilize the scientific research community?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. One has to do with, this is always a little bit esoteric when people talk about things like indirect costs. And what we actually mean is the costs that are necessary to do the research, but they're not specific to a single project. And, my examples at MIT are things like running our nuclear reactor or running our nanofabrication facility or all sorts of, at any university, keeping the lights on. That is the kind of thing that needs to be stabilized. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. Now, we have some particular problems that are not the case for every university. So, we're facing a large endowment tax. And we use our endowment in two ways. One is to match dollars that come in from the federal government to support our research opportunity. And the other is to give robust financial aid to students. So if I look at going forward, to have a place like MIT have an 8% tax on gains is injurious. We're not just socking away money. We're using that money for research and for student education. And so, I'm hoping that if the pendulum swings, we will get some relief there.
And as you're thinking about the steady state or the pendulum swinging on support and funding, the kind of research that MIT does, this long-term scientific research, if it is interrupted or stopped, what does it take to get it started again?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've seen it at MIT and I've seen it at peer institutions, long-term promising lines of research. When it gets interrupted, two things happen. One is there's a lot of technical issues with, if you will, powering back up again. But the other thing is you lose your trained talent. If you can't pay people to work in your laboratories, you lose people and you have to start at ground zero again with training people from scratch. That's incredibly concerning. I think where I see in a scary way that I think a lot of people can resonate with is if you're a patient in a clinical trial and those trials run out of money, you can lose access to those treatments. We have very high-tech facilities that, you don't just, I mentioned a nuclear reactor, you don't just power it down and power it up again by like flicking a switch. There are just a lot of things that require sustained effort. And if they're interrupted, we're not just losing the time of the interruption, we're losing a long time to restart the work and get it up and running again.
Dr. Sally Kornbluth is the president of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Kornbluth, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much. And one last plug. We have a website called curiositymission.org. And for people who want to understand how curiosity-driven research fuels this country's success, please have a look.
Thanks so much. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, security at major events now depends on how well government and contractors operate as one system. But first, a lot of science policy doesn't fail. It just never makes it through the system. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The interagency process is designed to coordinate decisions across government, but it can also become a choke point for science and technology policy. Understanding where that process breaks down is key to getting ideas into action. And joining me with his observations and recommendations is the Director of Science Policy and Advocacy at the Stand Up for Science Foundation, Cole Donovan. Cole, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me here.
There's been a lot of focus lately on cuts to the federal science agencies, but your argument in a recent paper is that the problem is bigger. It's about how science policy actually gets made. What do you diagnose as the core problem in the policy generating space?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems with how science policy is made in the federal government is really this idea that when you have a new administration coming in, or when you have a group of people who have a lot of bright ideas about how they're going to come in and fix the government, the thing that will oftentimes happen in a new administration is that you'll have a bunch of people crowd in together to try to make this policy. And then the question is, okay, how do those ideas actually get translated into reality, right? And so what will happen is that these people will come in, they might know government process, they might not, but they're operating in an ecosystem where there are a whole lot of players. And so what will happen is the White House will try to create processes by which that information can get distributed throughout the government. And if that isn't effectively managed, then it can become very difficult for those ideas to get translated into reality.
And after a time where the policy mechanism perhaps is disrupted, and as we've seen, science programs have been unfunded, there's a tendency to think that, well, when the next administration comes in, they could just flip the funding switch and everything will go back to where it was. You make the point that that is not true and not how it works. Walk us through that.
Yeah. So what will oftentimes happen is that when a new administration comes in, for one, you'll have a number of different things that are going to be immediately urgent that the new administration is going to need to take care of. So, for instance, when we came in 2021 into the Biden-Harris administration, there was an ongoing global pandemic. In 2008, there was very famously the financial crisis. And then in 2017, when the Trump administration came in, you had a whole bunch of people who had very little government experience who were just trying to figure out what was going on. So a lot of times the immediate focus of an administration goes to whatever that need of the moment is. And very rarely do you have a situation like you did in 2025 where an administration will come in with a dedicated plan for, okay, this is how we're going to go about reorganizing the government and bending it to our will. And I would say that the current administration had that plan, and they were able to implement their ideas very effectively, no matter how destructive those ideas were.
So when you think about that approach, what would you recommend to any incoming administration, regardless of party? There will be a new administration, 3 years from now. How should they think about the interagency process so that it becomes an asset and not a failure point?
So the interagency process is really this thing where a whole bunch of different government agencies come together and they form some form of consensus or idea around what type of policies should actually be implemented. And when that process happens, who owns the process, who decides what its priorities are, who writes the memo at the end that says what everyone is responsible for, that can have an enormous influence on which policies actually get elevated and which ones do not. So at the start of an administration, you'll usually get a memorandum that comes out that describes this process. In the Biden-Harris administration, it was NSM-2, which basically set up the National Security Council and the IPC process. Now, obviously, you will have different parts of the government that also can initiate their own processes, but fundamentally, these memoranda establish the set of rules by which these processes operate and how that information moves up the chain from the implementing authorities and the agencies up to deputies and principals, and then ultimately to the president if it's necessary for the president's signature.
Cole Donovan is the Director of Science Policy and Advocacy for the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Cole, you've said a lot of good ideas never even make it through that process. What stops them?
Basically deciding whether or not the process should even happen. So again, depending on where those process bottlenecks are, whoever owns the primary process mechanisms, that will usually set the direction for what actually happens in the government.
And how much of this is about the system itself versus the people who are inside it?
It's both, really. The people inside it matter probably the most, right? Because, again, their goals and their aspirations for what they want to see happen in the government ultimately sets the tone for what's happening. But if you don't create systems at the start that allow other people to advance their ideas up. Think about the difference between the NATO command structure and, our adversaries in Russia, where things are more centralized. If there are too many centralized systems, that means that certain processes will become inherently bottlenecked, and it can be much more difficult for other people working on other things to do the work they want to do.
So let's bring this back to the realm of science. If you were advising the next presidential administration, what is the first thing you would change about this interagency process, or the first thing you'd want to make sure that they understand about it as they're building their science policy agenda?
Well, so one of the key recommendations in the paper is to take an existing mechanism within the federal government. It's called the National Science and Technology Council, and it's already established under law, and give it the tools that it needs to be able to effectively elevate decisions that relate to science agencies. Given the broad-based destruction that we see across the federal government, it would be good if an organization like the NSTC were able to pull the relevant agencies together, quickly come to decisions, and then be able to tell people with the authority of the president or the highest level officials in science agencies, okay, it's time for you to go forward and you can move.
For people who are in the science space now, how should they work with the system as it is currently behaving to be advancing their scientific priorities?
Within this current government?
Mm-hmm.
That's a hard question. So right now, everything seems to be centralized in the Office of Management and Budget. And I think as we've seen, especially with the recent regulation that was put forward by OMB, they have a pretty fixed plan for what they would like to see done with the government. And it's not clear to me right now that there is a good way for people who are in positions to be able to move big things without the buy-in from OMB.
There are scientists out there, maybe in the federal government now, maybe aspiring to senior positions from outside the government in the next administration. What tools would you advise future science policy leaders to put into their kit bag now to increase their probability of success?
Again, I think that it all comes down to organization, making sure that you have a plan for how your policies are going to be implemented, who the key decision makers are going to be, and then what timeline you would want to use in order to be able to get that in, when you have to hit your key milestones.
Lots of people have never had the experience that you have had of working in those central science policy organizations inside the White House. What's really different about that from being in, say, CDC or NIH or one of the other scientific organizations?
I think, again, it's the level of interaction between the other policy councils and the extent to which things can really hit a snag if the people who really control the levers for what decisions go forward and which don't, simply don't have the same sense of urgency around a subject that you do.
Did it change your expectation of what success would look like?
Yes, absolutely. And the second time I came in, I knew very clearly what I would be able to do, and I was able to set goals and achieve my objectives that way. However, they were much less ambitious than my initial goals because I knew exactly what I would be able to do in exactly that amount of time.
So change the world might not be at the top of your accomplishment list?
No, but I can at least start the ball moving downhill.
Cole Donovan is Director of Science Policy and Advocacy for the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Cole, thanks so much for sharing your experience and your observations with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, security at major events now depends on how well government and contractors operate as one system. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Behind the scenes of mega events, contractors are running key pieces of event infrastructure, from cyber systems to communications. That's raising new questions about coordination, accountability, and who's responsible when decisions have to happen fast. Joining me to walk through how that works is CEO of the Professional Services Council, Jim Carroll. Jim, great to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Terry, for having us on.
We have a lot of folks who may be spending their time watching World Cup events now. We're a couple weeks into that, and we've got 4th of July coming up in just a couple of weeks. So as we think about these mega events that are, scattering across the calendar here, where do government contractors actually sit in the security picture?
It's been a busy summer. It's hard to believe that summer is upon us and we're having all of these activities. The World Cup is really exciting to watch, and I bet most of us are watching as many games as we can. What's interesting, is with the World Cup and July 4th coming up is how many of our member companies are contributing to the national security at these events. And it's everything from analysis of, the people coming in and their IDs and checking that. It's also drones, Terry, that are, out there checking the parking lots, checking some of these impromptu street parties, if you will, where the festivals are taking place, and making sure that everyone's being safe. It's really pretty remarkable technology that is happening this summer. And so not much of a summer break for our member companies.
Jim, drones are really a new, at least in the public mind, new addition to the whole security operations here. As we bring in this kind of new technology, how clearly are the roles between government agencies and contractors defined before they get on the ground?
it's a blur. It really is. And it's a wonderful blur in that the government contractors are sitting shoulder to shoulder with their colleagues, the government employees, and executing on this. And Terry, I have to say, since we were talking about summer being upon us, last weekend I went to go see the Blue Angels perform at Patuxent Naval Air Station, just a little bit south of us. And several of our member companies were there, along with maybe 10,000 people in the crowd, but several of our member companies were there because they have the technology to fly the Blue Angel, some of the other military aircraft. There were also drones, just like you say, the unmanned aerial vehicles on static display. And so many of our companies are manufacturing those for the military. It really is something how drones, whether it's domestically here for security, certainly, for our defense work overseas, the Department of War, we're seeing the military use them more and more. It really is remarkable.
Jim, when you come back to what you said before about contractors and government officials sitting side by side or shoulder to shoulder in ops centers and control centers, how does that affect accountability? If something were to happen, and so far everything seems to have gone pretty smoothly, but if something does go wrong, how is responsibility divided between the agencies and the contractors?
Yeah, thank God nothing's gone wrong, and it'll continue to be that way. I think as any of these things, when something slips through, and it really is, you heard that saying, the bad guys only need to be able to get through once. We need to block it up and be perfect every single time. If something were to happen, the knee jerk is it's going to be an examination of what went wrong and where the responsibility is. And, Terry, I hate to go back to something that was, very difficult, but you remember the DHS shutdown and the impact that had on airport security and some of the cybersecurity really slowing down and negatively impacting national security. And the contractors rely on a well-capitalized funding mechanism, contracting mechanism from the federal government. And now, this week, as most of the summer, they're calling for bad thunderstorms on various days this week. It reminds me of the need for FEMA to be well supplied and ready to go at a moment's notice. And all of that depends on stable funding, not only for the largest companies that we represent, of the 400 member companies of Professional Services Council, but also the small and medium-sized businesses who invest and perform and are ready to go at a moment's notice.
Jim Carroll is CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, you were just talking a little bit about cybersecurity, and going back to the mega events, many of the event systems, ticketing, communications, infrastructure are run by contractors. Has that changed expectations for contractors in terms of their own security and resilience?
No, I think they're getting used to it more and more globally. They're doing this not just for the United States, here in the 50 states and plus territories. They're doing it for foreign governments, and they're doing for foreign government presence in other countries. And so our government contractors can do it very efficiently, which means there's less cost for the taxpayer because we can flex as needed for these events. And it really is remarkable from, looking at your ID on your driver's license to make sure that you're the person that purchased the ticket and is supposed to be at these events. As I said, to making sure that, people are being safe. And so it really is remarkable, and it makes for enjoyable games. And Terry, I'm not holding my breath during these games that something's going to go wrong. I'm letting all my breath out with chants and, with happy noises from the U.S. winning.
Well, Jim, we talked earlier about the change that drone technology has made in terms of how these events are operated and secured. Another big piece, and you just sort of alluded to it there, is AI behind the scenes, engaged in both cybersecurity and physical security operations. The administration's new AI and cybersecurity executive order puts new emphasis on securing those AI systems. From an industry standpoint, are you seeing that change what contractors are being held accountable for delivering?
We are. And, GSA did roll out a request for comments for upcoming rulemaking for artificial intelligence systems. This request is a little bit different than the previous one, which came out a few months ago. This one, we went in and met with GSA, with some of our member companies. It seems that GSA listened and understand that some of the regulations, I'll say, some of the rules that they were talking about would actually limit AI solutions. And so this one seems to be much more targeted, a better balance, but it also something that our companies are very concerned about, not only from a national security perspective, but also even from a business sensitive issue of making sure that there is sufficient safeguards put around our American systems with AI. And so it's building a defense around the AI and without the sort of onerous restrictions of regulatory burdens. It really does seem to understand that the companies, need to just take the normal safeguards, to prevent interference. And I do think it shows that AI is here to stay. It's interesting, Terry, like I read a lot about AI, talk to a lot of our member companies who are using it. I think all of us who use it or supply it to the federal government believe that it will be there forever. I've seen some articles lately that AI is a bubble. For a variety of reasons we don't have time to talk about on today's show. I just don't think that's going to happen. There might be some narrowing of the field, but Terry, it's ingrained in the use of so many people these days, both in the government and out of the government, that having some safeguards around it, I think is a good rational approach.
It does sort of feel sometimes, Jim, like the government and industry is kind of finding its way through that AI corridor in the dark, feeling their way as they go. What are you hearing from your companies about where they'd like the balance to be for responsibility and accountability between the government and contractors when it comes to AI and AI security?
I think from a company perspective, you can sort of go, and I spent 10 years in the automotive sector, working for one of the large American manufacturing companies, that they just want some consistency across the board in the way that these are applied, these regulations, any rules coming out, so that it does not favor one size company over another. And that if there needs to be accountability, that there is a standard that is set or expected prior to something happening. And so, it is some minimum safeguards and minimum, sort of floors of what companies must have. And if they have those, there's some limited application if, things were to go awry. But this clarity, I think, is a good thing. And we know, Terry, our adversaries are using advanced technology to attack the American system. So having safeguards is something they're already doing, and having some guidance from the U.S. government is a good thing.
Jim Carroll is CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, I appreciate you joining me today, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for future World Cup victories.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Marine Corps has a new plan to grow the force by as much as 5% by 2032. The service hopes adding thousands of Marines will spell success in future wars. One lieutenant general says that goal is a step in the right direction to fix earlier versions of its force design plans. For more about this new goal and more context on changes ahead for the Marine Corps, Federal News Network's reporter Rachel Cohen joins me now. Rachel, it's great to have you on the Federal Drive. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me more about what the Marines are thinking about here and how these changes came about.
Sure. So last week, there was an event at the Center for Strategic and International Studies with Lieutenant General Eric Austin. He's the Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration, among multiple other hats that he wears in acquisition and so on and so forth. So they were having a discussion about what the force needs in the future. What kind of tech, what kind of skills. And, he mentioned service leadership had asked other, senior officials about the possibility of growing 4 to 5%. We think this is what we need. How do we get there? So they launched a 4-month sort of deep dive starting in February, ran from February to May. So just ended. And so that hashed out, what they need to do to get there. And so Austin said they had 18,000 proposals for ways that they could grow. Everybody has their idea, and they had to whittle that down to 9,000. And so those 9,000 line items or initiatives or what have you, that comprises what the growth will be. So their goal is initially 4% growth between 2028 and 2031, and then if they want to tack on another 1%, they can add that by 2032.
So 5% really isn't a lot of extra Marines. Where will they leverage that to get the most value? How does it make a difference?
So I think in a few ways. Austin said it addresses parts of the earlier force design effort that ended up not giving the Marines enough of the capabilities they think they need in the future. So it's kind of course correcting for that. A spokesman told me it's not just a few areas that need help. These thousands of new Marines would handle missions, that kind of run the gamut, right? So from intel, targeting, maintenance, it's usually not a problem of having too many people in the services, right? So they would staff up, kind of across the board. It could also help them integrate new things into the force, like attack drones, little quadcopters and such, that they're really racing to get out to the front lines. And the Marines are really trying to lean into that. So, it could help them, stand up new units to do things like that. They didn't actually provide any details about what is in those 9,000 items for growth. That's for a future budget cycle to, come out publicly, I think. And so, you're right. It's not a huge number, but, I think, several thousand is nothing to sneeze at, especially because they've been downsizing for the last several years.
And it would then kind of be a peanut butter spread, is one of DOD's favorite analogies. They just spread them evenly across the whole force then.
Sure. I'm not sure if it would be, hey, we have a shortage of 1,000 maintainers or something, and so most of them will go here, or, we only need 50 extra, people in this area. I don't know, proportionally how it would shake out, but, it sounds like there's need kind of everywhere.
What would the Marines have to do to make this a reality? Would they increase recruiting or, build their advertising budget? What would they do?
Sure. So they're already talking to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and lawmakers on the Hill about how to make it work, right? You want to bring more people in, you want to pay them, you have to have, a larger budget ostensibly. So they're looking to start working on that goal in fiscal 28. So now is, the time when they start building those plans. They're also asking for more personnel in 2027, so the upcoming fiscal year as well. So they need to secure funding for what they want to do and have a plan for what those Marines would do once they've joined. It could be that they see an opportunity in the larger defense spending bills that we've had to put that money toward things that sometimes get kicked down lower, right? More people that they don't always have the dollars for. So yeah, we'll see, I would guess, an uptick in recruitment. They're hitting their numbers so far this year. So, they might think, hey, yeah, we can ride that, for another few years.
And how does this fit into the Marine Corps' broader force design effort?
Yeah, so force design is this major overhaul that started in 2020 of how the service wants to go to war in the future. It was initially tailored toward a conflict with China in the Pacific, conflict that is more dispersed, more issues like signal jamming, more reliance on drones instead of, just sheer, human manpower, things like that. So, but they tweak it periodically to keep up with what's happening in the real world, and this is the latest iteration of that. And so, Austin said there's been some bumps and bruises along the way as they've figured out, how to get force design from, what he said was 60 or 70% of the way there. to, something that they're more comfortable with, something that they think, more accurately meets their future needs. And he said, it's really a case study in change management. Learning to iterate has been good for the Marines.
So the first real test of the viability of this notion will be to see if anything shows up in the 2027 appropriations for it?
I think maybe a little bit after that, right? Because the 27 budget is already going through on the Hill. I think they'll start tweaking certain initiatives that are already in the 27 budget, maybe turning those, ratcheting up things that they didn't think that they would have the money for, tweaking their recruitment projections, things like that. But, it sounds like at this point, the bulk of that effort, it'll start in 28, but, the stepping stones to that will be in 27, and they can always reprogram money throughout the year, right? You say, I need, I don't know, pick a number, $10 million, to go toward this personnel thing instead of, that training thing. So, it's entirely possible that we could see that. But, I think in large part, we would see it as part of the 28 rollout, but the services have to go through their fights about who gets what piece of the pie and, what OSD likes and what OSD doesn't like. And, all of that happens every year as they plan for future years.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for joining me today. And thanks for giving us an early look at this initiative.
Yeah. Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.